जी का खालसा वाहेगुरु जी की फतेह. Welcome to another edition of Encounters here on the Akal channel. Today we're going to be discussing a very important topic. It's radicalisation and fundamentalism, extremism here in the UK. In the South Asian community, the government legislation to tackle such and focusing on the Sikh experience of late with regard to protests, arrests and so forth. To discuss that with me today is a man called Jaswant Bora. He is an independent researcher, he's a trainer, and he's the author of a book called Safeguarding Against Extremism. So without further ado, let me introduce Jaswant Bora. Jaswant, Waheguਰੂ जी का खालसा, Waheguਰੂ जी की फतेह. Jaswant, I've tried to introduce you the best I can. You're a friend of the show, you've been a guest many times. We discuss radicalisation, extremism, fundamentalism within our communities quite often. As of late, do you think that what you're seeing in the media portrayal of what's happening in Great Britain with regard to the Sikh community, do you think that's a resurgence or a new development, or do you think it's just something that's been portrayed quite differently and has always existed within the Sikh community?
I think in terms of understanding some of the key dynamics and components to individuals becoming involved in, whether you want to call it violent behaviour, extremism or counter-terrorism, we have to look at what strategies, what policies are in place to address that. For those who may or may not be aware, the government's contest strategy, initially developed in 2003, post 9/11, talked predominantly about some of the issues around going to war and the risk of, and the backdrop of that.
Yeah.
Individuals becoming radicalised within the UK as well as other parts. And as we were in, just to bring it up to date, as we were what happened in 2005 and 7/7, the 4 homegrown suicide bombers, which was a real phenomenon that caught us by surprise within the UK.
Did it catch us by surprise, really?
Yes, because the whole notion of homegrown terrorism was something that is more associated with other countries, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc. Initially, it was recognised as a potential problem in terms of it could happen. I think Hazel Bloom was a previous Home Office Minister then, who said the biggest threat will now come more from homegrown terrorists. So when we had that,
Hazel Blair's.
When we had that, what happened was, on the backdrop of that, post 7/7, the government Home Office proliferated, introduced the prevent agenda. There were 4 strands to the whole document, the contest: prevent, pursue, protect and prepare. And the prevent element was very applicable to services and organisations working at grassroots level or in communities within societies to address the issues, not just of Islamic-inspired extremism, which was called at the time, or what was recognised, or should say defined, interpreted by the OSCT, or the Office for Security Counter-Terrorism.
Or considered the genesis of the threat.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Then, at the time, we had those who were in position and power, talking about where the biggest threat would come from. Charles Farr initially said that now it's Thomas Hurd who's taken over that particular role. And then we had the prevent agenda in terms of working in conjunction with that, which seek to incorporate a wider services. So in terms of that, there were 5 objectives. These have been scaled down in 2011 with the last prevent agenda, which I was privy to go to with other professionals, to look at some of the key objectives to address some of these concerns that we're talking about, whether it's Sikhism, whether it's far right, extreme far right, etc., etc. In order now to look at what can be done, what are the key drivers behind extremism, and what is the process involved in radicalisation, and what kind of terror threats are we working with. This was a new phenomenon, it was a new challenge, and the service is still trying to come to grips with it today.
Do you see the prevent agenda? For those at home that don't understand what the prevent agenda is and what its purpose is, could you just explain to them the 3 main categories and
the overall aim of the
processes?
Prevent agenda, which came out, as said, in 2006.
Yeah.
And the purpose of it, in quoting what it stays in there.
But was streamlined in 2011.
Yeah, well, it was changed. It went through 3 different stages of transition in terms of refining it. First one, 2006, to prevent, we can call it Prevent 1. Then Prevent 2, 2009 that came out, and then the latest was the Prevent 3, which you can call that. which was announced by, at the time, Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister, in June 2011 or January. The Prevent agenda really looks at now tackling three distinct areas within that particular agenda. It covers a whole broad spectrum of legal issues, threats of radicalisation, international threats, local threats, etc., etc. It talks about, in particular category, there's three areas, objectives that we need to consider and focus our attention on. The first one it talks about is the ideological challenge in terms of, for those who have that challenge, in terms of promoting terrorism and want to move terrorism forward through an ideology. The second objective talks about supporting vulnerable individuals who are at risk, who are at threat, and these are some of the categories we can talk about as we go along. It also talks about objective 3, working with key sectors where we can see a need, where we can collaborate and to help reduce the risk, identify those that might be at risk, or even identify those who are willing to engage in acts of extremism and violence against the state, against others, whoever it may be. So these three objectives were refined through table discussions at the time. I went to the consultation in 2010, and there was a lot of range of people from religious institutions, charitable, academic. So they looked at all that, and obviously OCT that chaired this meeting. So the consultation,
the government consultation, was, wide-ranging. It didn't just sit in a dark room and decide that it's going to use this agenda to pursue particular communities, to demonise them in the media, so to speak.
Well, the Home Office, that's what the intention was, wasn't it, to open up their arms and we have to sort of give them a pat on the back in this sense. At least they was willing to embrace people in a consultation. Now you're talking the Home Office, OCT, who many years ago were closed shop. The doors weren't really open to the general public, to religious communities, because obviously they're talking about them getting intelligence, them getting information, that could seem to be a threat to the safety of people's well-being.
Was that a reaction to the post 9/11 scenario where, that they had, and post Iraq also, that they had realised that keeping a closed shop, not really interacting and embracing the communities that may be hosting, inadvertently or unwittingly, hosting the threats that threaten the liberty of us all and our lives. But that the only way to really prevent something is to be engaging with those communities.
Well, this is the thing, and they recognised that, didn't they? And back to what I said earlier, just before that question, with always CT, who were formed because of that basis from the Home Office, were tasked with that responsibility from the Home Secretary, to deal with them kind of issues. Prevent comes along and now seeks to empower, and obviously we know there's a stigma with Prevent, there's a lot of challenges with Prevent in terms of demonisation of particular people and groups, etc. And they came along with an intention, right, we need to respond to that, obviously slow, or rightfully so, to prevent another terror attack, to prevent from people becoming radicalised, to prevent from individuals willing to support terrorism or even finance terrorism. Previously, we've spoken when David Anderson was here, who was government advisor on anti-terror law, and he explained the purpose of anti-terror legislation, which is to seek to prevent that, because the Terrorism Act 2000 clearly stipulates and states that anyone that seeks to drive forward an ideology, religious, political, or other, by the means of advocating violence, is contrary to Section 1 or Section 2. So we see there are criminal sanctions in place for those who tend to do that. So the anti-terror laws that came along almost side by side play a part in terms of looking at where they can now look at key individuals who, irrespective of the support, irrespective of whether or not they agree or disagree with democracy, want to, at full force, promote the ideology, whether it be Sunni, Wahhabism, whatever you want to talk about it, whether it be far right, with the intention of using and advocating violence against the public, against the state, or against local international allies or components.
What happens when somebody advocates a change or an attempt to change somebody's opinion or somebody's actions and somebody's way of life without explicitly advocating violence? Is there legislation that can deal with that sort of non-existent threat, but a threat?
I think everybody can share what they believe. Everybody can explain to others what they believe. But But when you get to a point or a position where you enforce that against a person's will, we can say that can constitute bullying. We can say that constitutes intimidation of another individual. We see this with terrorist groups. We see it within Syria, with ISIL, where they now are saying they're giving people an opportunity to change, but they must embrace the Islam, or they must embrace this.
Well, no, a particular strand of Islam.
Yeah, strand of Islam. Yeah. But in general, that's the general tenet of what they actually say. If they say no, then the other ultimatum is, we're going to kill you. We're going to behead you, whatever the case may be. So if we're talking to that extreme, that's very damaging and detrimental. Bringing it to the low end of the spectrum, it starts on someone, doesn't it? Remember, someone who intends to radicalize, if you want to use that word on that particular point, intends to radicalize somebody. What is the motive behind that? What is the intention? Are they seeking, because obviously radicalization and the term radicalization, which seems to be used numerous in a lot of volumes and a lot of disciplines now, with a term that really came around post 9/11, around 2004, used by European policymakers and commissions. These terms have been around a long time, but what they're trying to do is categorize individuals with extreme hard views. It's a bit like the word extremism. Extremism, defined in the current Prevent agenda, is a vocal or active opposition to fundamental British values, democracy and the rule of law. So what they're saying, if you come against that, then we will categorize you to some extent as somebody who's an extremist. And your extreme views seek now to dethrone what we in Britain have seek to promoted all these many years.
Okay, with regard to that, how would you describe the behavior of a group of individuals who hold a protest at a place of worship in opposition to somebody using that venue contrary to the beliefs that are espoused by the venue itself?
I think that everybody's entitled to protest, because with certain protests you have restrictions, you have boundaries, and some people tend to work in limits. Often, more or not, that's not the case. People spiral out of control, and it leads to some altercations, some form of violence, minor or major.
There was no violence?
No, I'm just saying in general, in terms of how protests can end up.
There was an accusation of intimidation.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, in terms of your question, to take that back, is people are entitled to do that. If that be the case, there'll be no such thing as free speech or democracy.
Yeah.
So in saying that, what I'm saying is that people can do that and exercise that right, but to the point where now you violate your own laws, you violate your own constitution, that needs to be looked at very carefully. Because if you're seeking to promote a belief or value, whatever it is,
in terms of the institution that was protested against,
and this is the whole point, terrorists do what they do, is because of the fact that they turn around now and say, well, this form of believers in the Islamic sense have watered down the Islam version, or whether this form of Sikhs have watered down their version of what they class Sikhism. And in order now to address that issue, in order now to bring some sort of cohesion whereby we can say, we all come together on a general consensus, there has to be some form of action that has to be taken. Because people now are going above and beyond, irrespective of, or regardless of, far as they can, some of the consequences, but they have an agenda. So if their agenda is to say we're going to violate what we believe, then this is where now we have to draw a line to say, look, something's gone wrong here, and then you have to take the action according to that institution as necessary. But where we have to draw the line is when you start to use violence to promote the action. In this country, as we know, within England and in America and other countries like-minded, there are certain laws and procedures to follow to do that. It may be a bit long-winded, it may take a bit of time, but there are processes in place that we can address these issues, that we can work through them. If it's somebody on a constitution or somebody on a particular belief that turns and says, no, I don't want to do it, but there's ways, isn't there? You have committees.
There are committees,
and
processes,
your committees, the whole general purpose of your committee is to vote, is to look at issues and address them. Yeah. And if not, then we move to the next stage, if not the stage after that.
But in sort of relation to the Prevent agenda, and law, there have been numerous arrests. Every one of those people have been released without bail. They were released initially on bail, and upon answering their bail, they've been released with no further action to be taken. The accusations were of intimidation. there was no intimidation.
Mhm.
Yet, having been exonerated under the prevent agenda and process, and exonerated by law and by the police themselves, the media takes it upon themselves to continue using labels as radical, extremist and fundamentalist. How does that help anybody trying to understand the difference between Islamic fundamentalism and extremism that is based or is stems from a particular strand of belief in the Islamic religion, which isn't the predominant or majority belief, and then being that same label being applied to the Sikh community and polarizing it in terms of either you believe in the tenets of Sikhism the way it's ordained, or you are supporting a minute minority of institutions, which there are less than 5, who are happy to violate the agreements that have been decades old, and also as sort of recently as August 2015, where the majority of the UK 300 organisations agreed to a particular restriction upon who can and can't partake in an Anand Carnage ceremony. At what point do you allow the media to misrepresent what has happened and who was responsible?
Well, the media are always quick to label. The media are always quick to categorize. You may have somebody who may have a view, and rightfully so, and based upon that view, the media is quick to say, well, that view is very extreme. If that be the case, then we have to look at subgroups of Islamic terrorists, on whereby, for example, Taliban, who the way they deal with their women, for example, if you look at the attitudes and concepts, they're very extreme. And if we're talking about some of that being imposed in the UK, i.e. in the form of Sharia law, etc., whatever the case may be, then we're going to know for that ain't going to work with democracy, because it's very extreme to the extent it talks about treatment and favoritism. But in terms of bringing it back to your question, and using some of these examples, what we're going to take into consideration is people will label people as extreme if they defend what they believe. Everybody has a right to defend what they believe. But there's been this underlying
and often explicitly stated sort of allegation that these protests are not about religion, but about a woman's right to marry outside of her own religion or ethnicity. And that there are these underlying sexist attitudes driving these protests. So with your sort of example of Taliban and their attitudes to women, they're sort of being abused. That example is being abused to label these protests in a similar light.
Well, in terms of abuse, and we know that any form of abuse is not right. And we can go back to the element of the safeguarding concept. And then the categories of abuse: physical, neglect, emotional, sexual. That happens every day to a lot of people. In terms of the abuse there, hence why within particularly Asian communities, or probably more the Sikh community or Indian community, we recognise the legislation that came in around forced marriages, which is to probably address some of these issues, because one thing leads to another. Someone outside the caste will lead to another to being forced to do something they don't want to do, or violate. Hence, legislation comes in. Back to our questions earlier, it plays a part in protecting a particular individual. I think in terms of trying to get to a conclusion on that and something conclusive, it has to boil down to those who represent that, those who interpret that. And I watch a lot of debates on YouTube between Sikhs and other individuals and Muslims, whatever. And how I was watching one the other day in Finsbury Park in London, where Hyde Park, sorry, that's it, where they was debating on a particular issue and particular context. A Muslim is saying this means that, and the Sikh say this means that. And you can see people are so losing to quote things out of context, isn't it? So it's up for those now to reinforce and look carefully, all their scholars, whoever they may be, to do that. That's what we say Islamists or extremists or terrorists to that extent do. They're very tactful of taking things out of context, but there's a particular purpose why they do that. It's a strategy. Hence, ISIL have their strategy. hence Al-Qaeda have their strategy. Everyone has a particular strategy. Some is similar, some is different. And this is what we're saying today in this particular program. When we're talking about issues and how they relate to England, we may not be able to be freely seeing fighters go through the air in Birmingham, West Midlands or London and throwing bombs in Birmingham city centre, etc. We may not be seeing, houses that have got bullet holes in, though we do have certain crime where shooting takes place. We see that more often in the East. But what we are saying, there are individuals within local communities at grassroots levels who seek now to promote what these people believe and recruit on that basis. This is where now we go back to the Prevent's role. He's trying to empower individuals. Prevent doesn't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, or it doesn't. Who has all the answers? Who are the eyes and ears of what's going on? Is everybody in the local community. There's people out there, see what's going on, know what's going on, hear what's going on, and it's up to them as well to act upon that kind of information, whether you want to call it intelligence, whether you want to call it information, whether you want to call it a discussion. And that was some of the things that recognised in some of David Anderson's reports on anti-terror laws, where some of these people that were prevented from committing a terror attack were found in cafes and listening to this discussion, and people reported that. I mean, it's alarming to suggest that, even Scotland Yard said, and I said in the public, there are over 100 terror threats a week. These are just threats, by the way. Yeah. To what extent will they materialise? So we've seen what's happening, and since I think our last discussion, our last programme, we've had a lot of things that take place. We talk about Charlie Hebdo attack. We talk about what's happening in America.
Yeah, Bastille
and so there's a lot of things in the driving of that truck in France. Yeah. Now, to what extent do you get someone who's willing to follow that? I'm not saying Sikh community or the community is intending to do that, but you get somebody who's on the periphery, and let's talk about one particular aspect, who's got mental health issues, who's got problems around the psychological well-being, tips the scale and says, right, I've had enough, that's it, I'm going to go all out and do what I'm going to do. And next week, interestingly, we've got this program. I'm attending a conference on extremist task force group, chaired and hosted by the World Psychiatric Association, that are looking at issues around public health and how they can fuel individuals to engage in acts, because there is these issues involved. Because if someone goes beyond what we call, a point of no return, then to what extent will they now engage in a full act of what we call terrorists? Because we have to look at now, how do we label a terrorist, how do we define a terrorist, and how do we define extremist?
We're going to take a quick short break. Sure. We'll come back for sure and discuss the mental health aspects of what we're talking about. Also prevent the actual process, the actual legislation, and the community that it's mainly targeted at, ostensibly, is the Muslim community. And regardless of how we want to, PC that, that's the truth. The truth is the Prevent agenda was specifically targeted at Islamic terrorism. Whether that's going to now be used because of media pressure on other communities also, absolutely, remains to be seen. But with regard to mental health, Prevent agenda, abuses of the Prevent agenda, and the Muslim community's reaction to it, we'll discuss as soon as we come back. So this conversation is nowhere near over. Join us after the break again, and we'll continue discussing Prevent. वाहिगुरु जी का खालसा वाहिगुरु जी की फतेह। Guru Fateh Ji, welcome back to Encounters. We're still here with Jaswant Bora. We're still discussing radicalism, fundamentalism, extremism in the UK with regard to the Prevent agenda from the government that is ostensibly to tackle the growth and the exploitation of radicalism by clever people targeting not so clever people, to put it bluntly. So just basically, we're talking about this agenda like it's the be-all and end-all and it's the cure-all of the UK's radicalisation issues and problems. The British Council of Muslims, just this week, have announced their intention to set up a parallel initiative that will address the same issues but address them in different ways. It's been, the catalyst for these things among other things, is issues like a young child drawing a picture, not being able to he used the word terrorist house, where he meant to write a terrorist house. And because of that, the school was not in a position to use any kind of discretion. A process was entered, and during that process the child had to be arrested. He was taken to a police station. He was questioned about his motivations for writing he lives in a terrorist house and not a terrorist house. And these things, that's one a highlighted example of the sort of things that can cause prompting the Muslim Council of Britain to initiate its own parallel process. What do you think that's a bonus, or do you think that's a hindrance to the sort of things that you believe the Prevent agenda is there to address, and will it counter the things they're trying to address?
I think it's a very challenging question on the basis that it hasn't come into fruition yet, the documentation, but the intention is there. I'll answer that. But in terms of, as you mentioned about the police and with this child and arresting the child, this is problems that pre-exist with this agenda. Is that when you are labelling somebody like that, it boils down to a few factors that determine the action. One may misunderstood that, may misinterpret what the individual is saying. So there's several factors that can contribute towards someone being labelled and not labelled, criminalised or not criminalised. Yeah. On that basis, but obviously, in terms of safeguarding, they have a role and responsibility to do that. So in terms of that, then they're looking at whereby to what extent was that information that they put on there genuine statement from themselves, or was it a question where in terms of writing or legibility, I misunderstood that what it meant to me was something else. So they have to kind of look at that, don't they, in that kind of basis. But in terms of
the criticism of the Prevent process,
the Prevent process
was that there was no discretionary sort of grace allowed to the teachers. The teacher could have simply asked, "You've written terrorist house."
Well, the difficulty.
What does that mean? And the child would have said, "A terrorist house, as in a house that has no sort of separation between two, and we are the middle of several."
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, the difficulty you got there is as I'm saying, and expounding on it, is that they have a duty to respond to anything that they may seem to be alarming or disturbing views. Yeah. And rightfully so. Obviously, you want to look at it, don't you, to sort of look at why you're writing that, where it's coming from. However, the legislation or the procedure or the policies that exist now, post 7/7, right up until now, 2016, last year, we had the new anti-terror legislation come out, Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015, which now specifies authorities and others to take action where they see someone that is at risk or could be drawn. Yeah. Hence them thinking on that mindset, this is probably a potential route in terms of views and images. And you also have the Prevent Duty guidance, which talks about kind of ways in terms of how we could manage that, looking at monitoring, looking at internet, looking at sharing of information. So they have that kind of duty, don't they?
So to work as a dual process, it would be one highlights potential
it's collaboration, isn't it?
People, and the other one.
Absolutely. We're working in collaboration. We're working in conjunction with others to identify early signs. I think it was Mark Rowley, who is the lead for the Metropolitan Counter-Terrorism Unit, said it at the Home Affairs Select Committee last year that spotting early signs is critical, and I quote that. In terms of him saying that, he's saying well, look, we have to identify early signs. Signs and triggers could be two different things, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
So an early sign, an indication, could be somebody writing, could be wearing a material, wearing a particular piece of clothing, it's something on the image on the phone. So we have to kind of look at all them factors. But in terms of the other question about the Prevent and the response to the government or counter-response to the government's Prevent agenda, which does need to be looked at again, I do believe that, because considering it's been 5-6 years since this one came out. Yeah. And obviously the threat level has somewhat enlarged, become more complex, more diversified. I think Professor Kundai was an individual who wrote some response to the Home Affairs Select Committee, talking about the stigma of it, talking about the restrictions of it. Hence, and I think a lot of people are taking some of them views on board, and other views and other policy and other documentation, other risk factors, and there's a multitude, isn't there? And this is another version that they intend now to not so say duplicate, but they intend to sort of install
as a parallel.
in a parallel. Now it's going to be interesting to see the challenges that come with that. Firstly, because of how they're going to define extremism, terrorism, and radical, etc., etc. Secondly, what kind of assessments they're going to look at, templates to work with that. Because we're not just talking about addressing terrorism and extremism through the use of religion, or imams or different scholars for that matter. We're talking about a whole broader spectrum, back to what I said earlier, like mental health issues.
Absolutely.
What about them experts that need to play a part? How do they play a part? Well, there's psychological abuse involved, isn't there? There's psychological trauma, because that's what abuse brings, trauma.
Psychological coercion.
So this is it. So to what extent do they play a particular role? And they will play a particular role. Now, this is where the preventive gender does not give you any strong guidance on that. It gives you a lot of suggestion, or implies within the agenda. That's why they brought a whole load of and a whole range of services with expertises around the table to discuss these matters. And they involve charities, they involve criminal justice, they involve the health sector, and looked at individuals. What can you contribute? Basically, me paraphrasing, what can you contribute? Or do we need to look over there? And one of the questions I asked at that particular time to Charles Farr directly was, to what extent are parents grooming their children? With issues of extremism and terrorism, indoctrinating them basically, because they're right there, they're 24/7 in there. Okay, so these were questions, and he had to concede to the fact that we can't do it on ourselves. We can't do it. Our expertise or our information lies within these particular areas. We can look at all international threats and intelligence, but at grassroots is another level. At grassroots,
the fundamental relationship between a parent and a child, is that something to be scrutinised? Do you think that's required?
A parent and a child. A parent can bring the child up, and that's what the Children Act states. The Children Act states that the child is best brought up not by the state but by the parent, and I quote that right from the documentation.
There's no bigger influence on a child.
Yeah, exactly, and the state recognised that. Obviously, they do not want children going into care. They do not want children going to residential. They want to eventually. That's the whole essence of what they do, is to put them back within the family setting if it's safe to do so.
With regard to, you've alluded to the Prevent agenda now looking into and looking to understand the effects of mental illness. With regard to, because I have to bring it back to the issues that we as the Sikh community are facing, and we have issues of radicalisation and extremism. Of course we do.
Absolutely.
But those issues that are being highlighted by the media are not the same issues that the Sikh community understands that are its issues. We have issues of radicalisation and extremism. The media highlights the issues that are other to those. So in regard to when we're talking about mental illness, we're looking at 55 arrests at a particular place for a particular purpose. All of those people were released without charge. They answered bail. They were released on bail. They answered bail and were told that no further action would be taken. So ostensibly no laws had been broken. Is there a danger in the future that legislation like Prevent could be used to associate mental illness with a behaviour that hasn't broken a law but allows the law enforcement agencies to then use that legislation, the Prevent process, to remove individuals from the public sphere under, section them basically, to put them in sort of psychiatric care until they can be deemed to be thinking normally?
Well, the Prevent agenda doesn't possess the expertise, does it? It opens its arms to other sectors to do that job for them. Prevent agenda doesn't have that. If you read the Prevent agenda, there's numerous sections to it, and it talks about this sector and that sector. Hence, Objective 3 is to work with all sectors. Now, in terms of the legislation, there's a couple of points what you said. In terms of the legislation, that will assist to some extent with working within Prevent. How would it assist in terms of, yes, we talk about the Terrorism Act, earlier 2000, which talks about, anybody that advances a cause by the use of violence as a criminal offence. We can look at the 2006 Terrorism Act, which came out and talks about things like, for those who insist now on glorifying acts of terrorism, disseminating publications. That also talks about in terms of addressing that element of it, where those who seek to go out there and recruit and radicalise other individuals are using these kind of mediums. So the legislation plays a role in that respect. Now, in terms of mental illness, which is a very strong word in that sense, or mental health rather per se, is another big issue in itself, because we've got to take in consideration when people recruit individuals, they look at the vulnerabilities as well. To what extent is this individual vulnerable to the point where it's going to be a quick access? I can get in there, I can radicalise this individual in a matter of minutes as opposed to a matter of years, months, whatever. And this is another element to it, where there was a case of Nicky Riley, who was a young white male. At the age of 9 years old, he was diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. As you can see, a condition there already, which would affect him in a lot of multiple ways.
The guy in the calf.
Sorry?
The guy in the calf.
Yeah, in the little giraffe cafe in Exeter.
Yep.
Now, Plymouth. Now, we look at that whereby he had that condition. Later on in life, he met with professionals, including mental health professionals, and he spoke about, terrorism with him and all at that point. And at that point, this agenda was very premature, wasn't it? In the sense of he was just coming in. So not many people took it too seriously as they do now, and we're still coming to grips with a lot of stuff, by the way. In terms of that, he turned around now and befriended some individuals in his own comfort of his own home. And this is another term that was termed where people seek now to indoctrinate individuals and radicalise them in their own homes. These were termed the new madrasas, because this is where the whole point where someone can be radicalised in their home. So the label is
online, or
online, through the internet, through social media, and that's a big medium, isn't it? It's a big access to people becoming radicalised, and that resulted in him befriending some religious extremists, groomed him, radicalised him. He changed his name to Abdullah Azim, and etc. And then during that course, subsequently, he goes and gets a bag, some explosives, and as we said, goes to blow. So it does play a bigger part. It plays a critical part, especially in the sense that, we're looking at someone who had autism. We're looking at somebody who had mental health conditions, and obviously difficulty in every day-to-day manage. And in the health and social care sector, my question is how many more are vulnerable in that in that regard? And a lot of them, there's a lot of services coming up. So recruiters on that basis are becoming more smarter. I wouldn't necessarily say intelligent, but becoming more smarter in the sense of they're looking at these kind of individuals. And this is the whole point. We're at this conference next week to discuss some of these issues around what role can those within the psychiatric division, mental health division, prevent another 7/7, prevent a 9/11, prevent a Madrid bombing. But remember, it all starts from someone, doesn't it? So if someone has got a gradual decline, and this is where we look at things at micro level. At micro level of radicalisation, these are things that affect them. Identity, sense of isolation, grievances that they may have, feeling a sense of rejection, being bullied. These all factors, and these factors can become trigger points to that radicalisation.
You've mentioned trigger points. You've mentioned that these things do start somewhere. We're almost at the end of the show, so I'm going to go all the way back to where this does start. And all the extremism, all the radicalisation, whether it's Sikh extremism and radicalisation and the genesis of that being events in a totally different continent. And there's no threat to Sikhism in the UK. There's no Sikhs being arbitrarily arrested, extrajudicially liquidated in the streets of the UK or Europe or America. It's ostensibly an issue in South India, in the Punjab, but yet it becomes a trigger for potentially people being radicalised in the UK. As such, there's the elephant in the room is British foreign policy. To the whole reason we need a prevent agenda, to the whole reason that the Muslim community in the UK is at risk of being radicalised. It's being radicalised by something you said earlier. We don't see aeroplanes bombing Birmingham city centre. We don't see buildings full of bullet holes. No. But these Muslims in their own communities, they are the diaspora, and their own home communities where they originate from, do see American-made, European-made planes dropping American and European-made munitions upon their city centres. and Eliza Manningham Buller, when head of MI5,
Yeah, former head. Yeah.
did say, no, but when she was the head, she did contradict Tony Blair completely, saying that the invasion of Iraq, the illegal invasion of Iraq, was the single most sort of significant catalyst of what we are now seeing and terming as homegrown terrorism, radicalization. At what point does the prevent agenda sort of try to cope with the fallout of British foreign policy?
Well, the prevent agenda really situates itself on a spectrum where it's dealing really with grassroots. Yes, and we can argue the fact that this is where some of these potential terrorists could come from. We're not denying that for 1 minute. But you've got the other strands: pursue, protect and prepare. Now, these are mobilised with that offensive to prevent any atrocities like that happening. And obviously we talk about intelligence gathering, CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, MI5, and all these particular governing bodies that are tasked with intercepting intelligence or looking at how credible the threat is to states or communities or individuals. So in that sense, what Prevent is really tasked with is looking at probably individuals who have the potential, how vulnerable they are to get to that particular level. Now, you may not have to be educated. You may not have to seem to have millions and thousands of dollars or pounds or rupees, whatever the case may be. But if you seem that you have the potential, you know, to take somebody, groom them, recruit them, groom them, radicalize them, and just to get them to put a backpack on and drive into a building is not much hard work to do with individuals who are very vulnerable. We see that happening, obviously, you know, in different parts where even in you know, certain research and certain information and certain books, the state tell you that even in places like Iraq, they're paying as much as $50 to young people to do that. So my concern in my publication also addressed that issue in terms of to what extent will we wake up, God forbid, one day whereby we will see the first young person to have committed an act of suicide. We've already had UK nationals do that in 2005, 7/7. So my concern really is to what extent will we wake up one day to that disturbing news. And remember, in 2006, the youngest person to be convicted of a terrorism charge, a terrorism offence, was a guy called Mohammed Munshai from Lancashire, Blackburn.
Yeah.
That changed last year with a young individual who was arrested and charged at the age of 14. What was he arrested and charged for? Because his intention to plan a terror attack on Anzac Day in Australia by grooming somebody over there in conjunction, collaboration with him to behead soldiers who were out on a march. This is the threat level that we've got now. These are the potential risk factors, and these are why young people, especially young people, and I focus on that even younger, we need to be looking at to what extent can we put measures into place, credible assessments into place, strong, effective intervention into place to prevent stuff like, same with the point you made about these Sikhs walking into the temple, sitting down there, these young individuals. How could that have been prevented? Somebody have that information, have that intelligence, because that's all you can act upon at the time, can't you?
Yeah, but that could have been prevented by the temple itself, you know, living up to the ideals of the religion you know, it claims to represent. So that was, but this week it's been, you know, fascinating talking to you again.
Thank you.
But this week that's all we've got time for, unfortunately. But just this is an ongoing conversation. I hope the people at home understand that with Encounters quarterly, we will be speaking with Jaswant Bora. We will be discussing radicalisation, extremism as an ongoing conversation. It's not something that we talk about and then forget about. It's not a topic as such. It's something that we live with every day. We have been living with it for many decades. So it's something that we always need to keep on top of. I you know, thank you again for taking your time out, being part of the Encounters team.
Just to conclude and appreciate this program, because we're going to raise awareness to the wider community.
Absolutely, yeah.
For those interested in understanding the publication, the research that I put together, it's available on Amazon. It's called Safeguarding from Extremism, a New Approach Post 7/7, and it kind of brings everything together in a nutshell. So those who are interested in that can find the publication online, and read the publication. It'll give them a good grounding. It enabled them to get a concrete foundation and understanding this agenda and some of the issues involved in that.
And it is important for Sikhs to understand the national perspective on radicalization and prevent agenda and how to combat that. When you're reading headlines and you don't understand why a headline is written in a particular way about the Sikh community, when the Sikh community and members of it act in a particular way, there might be a dissonance between the two. But there's not. If you understand the national agenda, you have to learn that your actions will be perceived by others who are not privy to your intimate knowledge of your own religion. So with that in mind, we thank Jaswant Bora again and look forward to seeing him again soon, and we'll discuss this and whatever is current in relation to it then. So until then, it's all goodbye from us. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.